Carroll Quigley was a professor at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service in the second half of the 20th century. He was revered by his students, who included a young Bill Clinton, who would, in his 1992 acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention, mention Quigley in particular as a major influence. Quigley's most popular course was called The Development of Civilizations, and many Georgetown alumni would go on to say that this course in particular had a bigger influence on them than anything else in their undergraduate experience. The material for the course would go on to serve as the basis for Quigley's book, The Evolution of Civilizations. In The Evolution of Civilizations, Quigley begins with the observation that civilizations come into being, they rise and expand, reach a peak, and then begin to decline until they eventually collapse and die. Quigley proposes a theory of this civilizational life cycle. He argues that it is driven by a fundamental mechanism that he calls the instrument of expansion. The instrument of expansion is a social organization that accumulates a material surplus and directs this surplus towards innovation and expansion. An example, in his view, in classical Greco-Roman civilization is the institution of slavery. And in the first phase of Western civilization, he argues that it was the feudal system. Over time, the instrument of expansion begins to decay because its caretakers begin to direct the accumulated surplus away from innovation and expansion and towards unproductive ends, like personal glorification or unproductive conflicts. When this happens, the rate at which the civilization is expanding begins to decline. And this produces conflict because the various structures of the civilization have been set up around continued increasing expansion, and also because people in the civilization recognize this on a certain level and recognize that something has gone wrong. As a result, the institution enters a period of crisis, and its fate hangs in the balance. This crisis can be resolved in one of two ways. Either the vested interests who are causing the decay of the instrument of expansion win out, and as a result, the instrument continues to decay until eventually the society becomes so weak that it can no longer defend itself and is destroyed by outside invasion. This is the path that leads to death. But there is another way. The civilization can be saved if an instrument of expansion comes into being that is functional and that is actually directing the surplus towards innovation and expansion. This can happen in one of two ways. The first is reform, where the existing and decaying instrument of expansion is reformed so that the surplus is redirected back towards innovation and expansion. It can also happen through circumvention, where a new instrument of expansion comes into being that routes around the previous instrument of expansion, which continues to decay, and which on its own serves as the basis for a new age of expansion. In this case, the society lives to go through another cycle until it faces yet another stage of conflict and crisis that it has to effectively navigate. Quigley believed that Western civilization had been through two crisis periods that it had effectively navigated in both cases through circumvention. The first happened around the 14th century, when the decaying feudal system was circumvented by what he called commercial capitalism, exemplified by merchant families like the Medicis of Florence. The second period of crisis happened around the 18th century, when the decaying system of commercial capitalism was circumvented by industrial capitalism, exemplified in the institutions in England in the Industrial Revolution. Quigley believed that at the time of his writing, around 1960, that the West faced yet another period of crisis, and that it was not yet clear whether there would yet again be a new age of expansion, or whether the vested interests in this case would win out and that the West would ultimately decline and eventually collapse and die. Quigley's theory is interesting not just because it's a useful framework for thinking about the problems that our civilization faces and its overall situation, but also because it's an example of a systematic and scientific approach to the study of social phenomena, which can be applied to other areas to aid us in our understanding of social problems and puzzles that we haven't yet resolved. I'm Zack Lerangis. I work at Bismarck Analysis. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.